The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 3rd chapter. And the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He's gone out of his mind." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons." And he called them to him, and he spoke to them in parables. "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. But if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly, I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said, 'He has an unclean spirit.' Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, 'Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you.' And he replied, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking at those who sat around him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Beloved of God, grace to you and peace from the one who created us, redeemed us, and moves among us still. Amen. One of the first communities I came to know when I moved to Mexico to serve as a missionary was the community of La Estación. La Estación, which means the station, is a squatter settlement that grew up around the old federal rail line that used to run through the city of Cuernavaca in the central Mexican state of Morelos. It had started with a few lean-tos built by laborers that worked the rail line decades ago, but it's now home to some 10,000 families living in makeshift homes. It's a poor community. In spite of all the excellent training and support I had received from Global Mission prior to beginning service, my first visit to La Estación almost laid me flat, with grief and rage, and something maybe even like guilt. There were no public services whatsoever in La Estación at the time, so the edge of the settlement had this giant wall of electrical meters that had hundreds of unauthorized connections hot-wired to it. Bare electrical wires were strung throughout the community, dangling haphazardly over homes that were made of every kind of found material. Families that had been in La Estación for many years had simple cinder block houses, but most were made of cardboard or scrap wood from pallets taken from outside the market. Hunger was a daily companion for most of the community's children. There were no water or sewage services, so on their way to the 1 or 2 public taps, people in the community had to step carefully over shallow open ditches, which carried sewage out of the settlement. As is so often the case in places of concentrated poverty, violent crime was a very real issue that people grappled with on an almost daily basis. And on top of all of this, the people of La Estación still actually don't have title to the land that their homes are built on. Cuernavaca grew up around it such that La Estación is now situated in one of the most prime real estate investment areas of the city, creating constant worry among members of the community that their homes could be razed one day with essentially no warning at all. It's one of the most difficult places I had ever experienced to that point in my life. It's also one of the most hope-filled. In the midst of the painful realities of this community, some of the women of La Estación decided to come together. With the support of a local community foundation and some international partners, including the ELCA, actually, they created a community center to address some of the settlement's needs. The community center is home to a breakfast program for the settlement's children, run by the women of the community. it hosts workshops for the women on everything from domestic violence to training in small-scale income-generating projects and economic cooperatives. And the center also hosts community festivals, like the one they do on Mother's Day each year. Now, Mother's Day in Mexico, always celebrated on May 10th, is a huge deal. And the women of La Estacion's community center had gone all out to help the children prepare the songs and dances and other performances they would share to honor their moms on that day. I arrived to La Estación about a half hour before the program was to start and went over to greet Fresvinda, who is still the coordinator for the center. We chatted for a bit, and then I tried to offer her a gracious opportunity to leave, knowing that she was carrying a ton of responsibility that morning. But instead of leaving, she squeezed my hand gently and just stood right next to me. After a few more minutes, she did get called away, but before leaving, she made eye contact with Guillermina across the big patio area and said, "This is how you say come here in Mexico. This can mean something a little bit different." So she motioned to Guille to come over, and Guille came over and said hello and chatted for a bit, and then she too just stood right next to me. When her daughter started to holler loudly from the other side of the patio, Guille called to Maria, and she stood right next to me. Eventually, Maria's attention got called elsewhere, so Lourdes came over, and then Domitila, and on and on. These women were responsible for all sorts of major things on this, the day that they themselves were being celebrated. And yet they didn't leave me alone for a single moment that entire afternoon. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and brothers and sisters are here, asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers? Who are my mother and my brothers? Who is my family?" My mama is a small woman of German and Norwegian ancestry, born and raised in North Dakota, with bright blue eyes and a whole lot of sass. She is also a small woman of indigenous Nahua ancestry, born and raised in a Mexican squatter settlement, with sharp brown eyes and a mischievous smile. My sisters are gifted, professional, upper Midwestern women who carry powerful energy into every room they enter and who make me laugh until I cry. They are also gifted, resilient Mexican women who carry powerful energy into their community and who, in the midst of the harried pace of their daily work, recognize the aloneness of the outsider at the party and draw her into the circle of belonging. Who is my family? Church, a lot of us have learned to turn to the Bible for solace and comfort, and sometimes it provides those things, but not today. Not for the crowd and the religious leaders and Jesus' own family, anyway. Today, the Bible is offensive. Jesus is offensive. He gets into it with the political rule makers and the holiness police of the day, people who lived with power and access and comfort under the rule of the Roman Empire. That empire had set up a society that made life terribly difficult for most people, and it had become so entrenched that even those who suffered under it dared not question it. But then here comes Jesus. He is clear-eyed about the reign of the Roman Empire, about how it holds oppression and indignity firmly in place with a coordinated, unyielding kind of power, about how ruthless it is, about how it excludes and alienates and makes people afraid, and about how religious leaders had allowed themselves to become tools of that empire. He is clear-eyed about this system, and he calls it what it is: satanic. He throws the religious leaders' own metaphors right back at them, declaring that he, Jesus, is the one strong enough to overwhelm Satan's reign and replace it with the merciful, just, inclusive reign of God. This isn't just offensive. It's crazy. Jesus knows that the world as it is not the world as God intended. But the kind of mercy and justice and inclusivity that he's pointing to is just so far beyond the imaginations of those gathered that it makes him sound insane to the people around him. He proclaims and lives this new way of ordering the world with such confident authority that it makes even his mother and his sisters and his brothers worry for his sanity and for his safety. Who is my family? A house divided against itself cannot stand, Jesus says. Ooh, church. We know all about divided houses, don't we? We know about the political rhetoric that would have us believe we are safest and strongest when we stick to the ones who are just like us. We know about the economic rhetoric that tricks us into believing that what we want is more and more stuff when what we really want is each other. We know all about the religious rhetoric that suggests, or sometimes flat out declares, that some of us are somehow less than full and beautiful reflections of the image of God. And we know about our own literal divided houses too, don't we? We know about the pressures to present a calm and happy exterior, even when our families might be struggling mightily under the weight of crumbling marriages, or of mental health struggles, or of infertility issues or pregnancy loss, or addiction, or just a simple inability to connect with one another as deeply as we would like to in our own households. Who is my family? Beloved of God, a house divided against itself cannot stand. But what if Jesus is trying here to point us to the reality that in the world as God intended it, we are not, in fact, as divided as some would have us believe? What if our family is just a lot bigger than we have imagination for? Whoever does the will of God is my mother and my brother and my sister, Jesus reminds us. Not just whoever looks like me or acts like me or worships like me. Not just whoever loves like me or speaks like me or sees the world like I do. Not just whoever lives under the same roof as me, but everyone who does the will of God. There's no escaping it. We belong to each other. We belong even to the ones that we think don't belong. Who is my family? Whoever does the will of God is my mother and my brother and my sister. Jesus' proclamation here is offensively countercultural. He lived in a time when identity and stability and opportunity and responsibility were so tied up in family kinship structures that redrawing the lines of family and belonging would have elicited gasps from the scandalized crowd. But Mark's Jesus is completely unconcerned with being offensive, just like Mark's Jesus is completely unconcerned with scandal, because he is far more concerned with making a family out of the unlikeliest assortment of characters we could possibly imagine. He's far more concerned with binding himself to us and then to one another. He's far more concerned with noticing the outsiders at the party of life, coming alongside them in gentle companionship and drawing them in, and all of us together into the circle of belonging. Thanks be to God.